So we're here today to talk about an evaluation that the Department of Energy has out for public comment for taking its tank waste liquids, removing cesium from those liquids, taking that treated waste and glassifying it term, as in forever, in a shallow burial in the middle of the Hanford site. So Hanford Challenge hired Marco Kaltofen, who's going to be presenting today, to do a technical review of the evaluation because it's pretty complicated. There's, I think, over 1,000 pages of documents to look at, and it's a lot. So he did a technical evaluation. He's going to be talking about what he found in evaluating their evaluation. That's a fun one. And then we have Todd Martin with us today, who has been working on Hanford for over 30 years to give a little context for Marco's presentation. And we're co-hosting this event with Columbia Riverkeeper. So we have Simone Ancher here also, and she's going to be sharing a video to kick us off from that Columbia Riverkeeper put together that gives a little bit of context for the process they're using to decide if this waste meets criteria to be disposed in this landfill, which is called WIR, or W-I-R, the Waste Incidental to Reprocessing. Hanford Challenge, Columbia Riverkeeper, and then another group that we submitted joint comments with, Natural Resources Defense Council. We're opposing the WIR process. Marco's not going to be talking about that. He's more focused on a technical review of their proposal. But some of Simone's, the video Simone's sharing is going to talk about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Simone to share the video. And Simone, do you want to say anything about the video before you share it?
Yeah, so I'll just say we thought it'd be great to start with this video for this high-level overview, as well as just to remind folks that, Hanford is this really beautiful place with a future that we must protect, with a cleanup that's protective of all people. So we thought it was a really great way to ground our conversation before we jump into the highly technical breakdown. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get that shared.
Imagine the most toxic place in America. Is it a factory spewing neon green pollution into a river of floating dead fish? A city cloaked in toxic smog? Nope, you're looking at it. This is the Hanford nuclear site, 580 square miles containing the most dangerous radioactive and toxic waste in the Western Hemisphere. And it sits along the banks of the Columbia River, a river that provides drinking water to downstream communities, irrigation water for nearby farms, and prime habitat for the Northwest's iconic salmon. Tribal nations, including the Yakama Nation, have treaty-protected rights to the Columbia River's iconic salmon and the Hanford nuclear site. Now, the Trump administration wants to cut corners with Hanford cleanup. The target? Radioactive and toxic waste buried in massive underground tanks. Here's the plan. First, the United States Department of Energy will reclassify certain types of high-level waste in Hanford's underground tanks to low-level waste. With just a sweep of the pen, high-level waste becomes low-level. Clever, right? Then, the government will use the new label to justify leaving dangerous material in the ground at Hanford forever.
The Yakamas are still here, and that we're still going forward. We know we can't make it pristine, but we want to make it better than how it's being reclassified today. That's not acceptable because it's sacrificing the land here.
How will people use Hanford in 25 years, 100 years, and beyond? When cleanup ends, will Hanford remain the most toxic place in America? Or will it become a vibrant landscape where people can live, work, and fish? Hanford is a place worth fighting for, to protect people's health and safety, to hold our government accountable for treaties with tribal nations, to honor and respect all people that call the Columbia River home. You can help protect the remarkable people and places that depend on Hanford cleanup.
Thanks for sharing that video, Simone. We are going to turn it over, and for people who just joined, we're going to move through the presentations and then do a Q&A. So we're turning it over to Todd Martin to give some context about the comment period that's out right now.
Thanks, Liz. Can you guys see a couple nods or thumbs up? Okay, great. So my name's Todd Martin. I've been a tire kicker at Hanford and other Department of Energy sites for quite a while. I currently work as a consultant on environmental management issues. So the VLAW WEIR, let's just get off on the confusing foot right away. What does that even mean? Hanford has its own language, and it absolutely is not intuitive. Every Hanford document starts with a guide to acronyms, and it's usually several pages long, single-spaced. For today, we're going to try to narrow it down, as Liz said, to basically two important acronyms. First one is the VLAW WEIR, which means vitrified low-activity waste, waste incidental to reprocessing. And that's not a typo. It is waste to waste, back to back. But you don't need to remember that. When you see VLAW WEIR, we just want you to think about a proposal to dispose high-level tank waste in a Hanford landfill. And when you hear the other acronym, IDF, which is an integrated disposal facility, just think landfill at Hanford. This is a photo of the landfill that's been constructed there. Most of what we're going to talk about today is federal in terms of laws and policy, etc. But we didn't want to lose the fact that obviously Hanford is in the state of Washington, and the state of Washington does have regulatory authority there. As is usual, Hanford wastes are special. Tank wastes are no exception. Washington state does not have any regulatory authority over the radionuclides that are in the tanks, but they do regulate the hazardous chemicals that are intermixed with all those radionuclides. They do that via a permit that is issued to the Department of Energy for ongoing operations at Hanford. And the IDF is actually included in the latest iteration of that permit. So a lot of you already know this, but just a brief overview of the challenge at Hanford. There's 53 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste in 177 tanks. Those tanks were built between the 1940s and the mid-1980s, so they are old, well beyond their design lives. The second bullet I have up here seems self-evident, but when we talk Hanford, sometimes we lose the fact that the real goal here is to isolate these wastes from the environment and humans for a very, very long time. The effort to treat and dispose tank waste has been ongoing for actually over 60 years. Most people think it started in 1989 with the Tri-Party Agreement, but there were many earlier efforts. And every one of them has been plagued by technical setbacks, delays, cost growth, and very little actual treatment of tank waste. So we've had plans and plans upon plans, but very little progress. So a brief overview of the plan. The waste will be retrieved from the tanks, separated into a low activity and a high activity portion. Both of those will then be sent to facilities where they'll be mixed with glass formers and melted in melters to produce glass. That's a process that's called vitrification. The low activity portion that we're talking about today is proposed to be disposed of forever at Hanford in the IDF landfill. And the high activity portion would wait until there is a national repository available for it to be disposed. Why a national repository? Because the law says so. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act requires that any high-level waste has to be disposed of in a national repository, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Environmental Protection Agency have oversight over that process. One of the most important things we're going to talk about today is that high-level waste is defined by its source, by the process that produces it, not based on its hazard, not based on its threat to human health or the environment, source-based. What is the source for high-level waste? It is the first couple steps of reprocessing spent nuclear fuel. This is a photo of the Purex plant at Hanford, which was one of the workhorses of the Cold War. In this facility, spent nuclear fuel was dissolved in acid, and the bomb-making materials, such as plutonium, were extracted for use in the arsenal. Everything left over, the other radionuclides, all of the chemicals, the acid itself, was sent to the tanks where it sits today. And because it was created in the processes that occurred in this plant and others like it, it is defined by law as high-level waste. And all of that waste is required to go to a national repository. This is the proposed national repository, which is a great big hole in the desert in Nevada called Yucca Mountain. It has been a political hot potato for many, many decades. Currently, it is not open to receive waste, and there is no real valid process towards it becoming open to receive waste. However, as the law states, all of Hanford's high-level waste needs to end up here or in another site that has been selected and permitted as the national repository. So in addition to this facility not being open to receive waste, there's another twist. It is also slated to receive all of the spent nuclear fuel from commercial reactors around the country. And those public utilities that have been storing that waste very near their reactors and very near large cities are desperate to have a place to send their spent fuel and dispose of it, which means there's a lot of competition for space in a national repository if and when it becomes available. And that makes space expensive. So the estimated cost of disposing of Hanford's waste at the National Repository would be extremely high. As a result, the Department of Energy has a very large incentive to try to find a way to dispose some of that waste on the Hanford site to save money. I struggle with this because these estimated costs are just that, estimated. They're speculative. The repository itself is speculative. So we have these estimates of costs that may not be real, but have really driven programmatic decisions at Hanford for many, many years. So at this point, I want to go back to that source-based definition of high-level waste. There's a loophole in the process for tools, gloves, personal protective equipment, those sorts of things that are actually used in reprocessing activities that really don't need to be disposed of at a national repository. The WEIR process is essentially a paperwork exercise that will redefine high-level tank waste as low-activity waste, allowing disposal at Hanford and exempting the requirement to send it to a national repository. The NRC requires DOE to meet 3 criteria to qualify as WEIR waste. It has to do with the level of radioactivity remaining in the waste and the final waste form. And Marco's going to talk more about those details. So that's the why of the plan. And now to the what, which is called direct feed low activity waste vitrification. No Hanford presentation is complete without a picture of a tank farm. So here's the obligatory picture of the tank farm that you've already seen because there's one in Simone's video as well. It always has to sneak its way in. But this is the tanks under construction. Obviously, if you saw them today, they would be under dirt. You wouldn't see anything except a few pipes sticking out of the ground. Waste will be retrieved from tanks that are designated for low activity waste vitrification and sent to a small facility right next door. This is called the Tank Side Cesium Removal Facility. There are multiple columns that look like this stainless steel column that are full of resins that are aimed at removing radioactive cesium and some solids in order to reduce the level of radionuclides in the final waste form so that it will meet the NRC criteria to be disposed at Hanford. After the waste runs through these columns, it will be sent to the waste treatment plant, which is this very large suite of facilities. The tank side cesium removal facility and the tank farm that will be feeding it are just off the screen to the lower left here, so you can't see those. The waste will be sent to the highlighted facility, which is the low activity waste vitrification facility, where it will be mixed with glass formers and melted in a high temperature melter into glass and poured into canisters that look like this. And those will then be sent to the IDF for permanent disposal. So the question we are addressing today in the WEIR proposal is whether vitrified low activity tank waste should be permanently disposed at Hanford. And that's what I've got. I think I turn it over, Liz, to you or to Marco.
Take it away, Marco.
I can do that. All right. So I wanted to share a few of my technical comments about what came after reviewing about, and Liz, you underestimated. We had about 4,000 pages of documents that we reviewed. I'm going to go through each page here. No, I'm going to go through some of the key points that came from this. The bumper sticker version is simply this. The project has maximum allowable radiation exposures to members of the public. This project will probably come in under those maximum allowable radiation exposures, but only if three important issues are taken care of first. One of them is the so-called cumulative risk, meaning this is not the only source of radiation at Hanford. There are other sources, and they all contribute radiation exposure to members of the public outside of Hanford. And those are not accounted for in this project's permitting application. Another is that a certain percentage, about 10% of the wastes that would be disposed of at this IDF landfill have yet to be characterized. We're not sure what's in them. And it's impossible to determine what the risk to the public is if there's still parts of the waste stream going to the landfill where we just don't know what isotopes will be present. And the last one is this particular setup is very sensitive to what's called on-site intrusion. And that's simply members of the public carrying on their lives, whether they're building a home or drilling a well for groundwater or even cattle ranching at the Hanford site before the end of the 100-year period where this material must be left untouched. So how do we know if the project fails? What the Department of Energy requires is that before the waste is turned into glass, we've removed the maximum practical amount of radioactive cesium and similar materials before we treat the waste. Those were the shiny stainless steel canisters that Todd showed. The next is that the safety requirements are comparable to what would happen to members of the public even if it were treated as high-level waste, so that the maximum exposure to the public, there's no allowance for this being waste incidental to reprocessing. It has to be treated as if it was high level and meet the same standards. And lastly, it has to be incorporated into a solid physical form, and that the amount of radioisotopes in that solid form meets the usual concentration limits. When we looked at the different ways that this project could fail, meaning it didn't meet those three standards, one was that because there are other projects at Hanford, like the grouting of the old tunnels that collapsed recently, the demolition of the plutonium finishing plant, and some of the other sources of radioactivity, the fear is that the total risk from all these different projects is going to drive the public's radiation exposure to an unacceptable level. And that would make this project unlawful. We can't evaluate that because this IDF proposal assumes that it's the only project exposing the public. And this is not correct and needs to be addressed before it can move forward. The second would be that we have to fully characterize every waste stream that's going into this landfill or prohibit these uncharacterized waste streams from being disposed of in the future. And the last is that it's clear that early on-site intrusion, meaning anyone who is operating as a member of the public near the IDF within the next 132 years. And it's 132 because there's a 100-year compliance period. Plus, it will take 32 years to complete the project. So the public must be prohibited from entering that area for that entire time, or the project can fail and result in an unacceptable radiation dose to members of the public off-site. Now, after reviewing all of the documents, which some of them are as much as 15 years old, that's how long this project has been underway, there are still some uncertainties which the DOE admits to, questions we simply don't know the answer to. First of all, it's assumed that all of these big stainless steel canisters containing classified waste will leak. They are going to leak. They're not going to hold up over time. And the chemistry of what happens to those wastes as they start leaking is unknown. We don't know how it's going to react with groundwater and with the sands and soils and silts in this part of the state of Washington. So we don't know what chemical products will be created, and that means we don't know how fast they'll move. We don't know the entirety of all the different sources of radiation exposure because of Hanford to members of the public. We don't know the isotopes in the uncharacterized fraction of the waste. We actually don't have a plan for safeguarding this site for the next closure plus 100 years. There is not a plan in place at the moment for ensuring that there is no public intrusion into the site. We don't know what happens to the doses to the neighbors of Hanford if that early on-site intrusion occurs. And what that means is we understand that the people who might drill a well or build a house near the IDF landfill are going to have a certain exposure, and that their activities could actually release radioactive waste onto the site. But we don't know what will happen to members of the public because that dose hasn't been addressed in their proposal. And the last is climate change. Very modest increases in rainfall in this area greatly reduce the safety factor built into the IDF. And that means as little as a 4-inch increase in annual rainfall in this area because of climate change, well within the low-end estimates of what might happen, could cause a 95% reduction in the safety factor for the IDF. The institutional controls that are designed to prevent intruders from gaining access to the site and engaging in construction or farming activities that might weaken and endanger the IDF are supported by very weak evidence. That is, the controls that they depend on assume that Hanford's budget won't be cut in the next 132 years, that groundwater programs will continue, that people will be working on the site doing cleanup, and that our environmental standards and criteria, the rules we set for protecting the environment, won't be substantially weakened in the next 132 years. Now, some of you may have noticed that in the past 4 years, a lot of environmental standards and criteria actually were weakened. So our track record on predicting 132 years of not weakening environmental regulations is not supported by evidence. This is the only graph that's here. This is being recorded if people want to go back to it. I would certainly understand that people's eyes might glaze over a bit. But what's important here is if you look at the far left-hand part of the graph, at the bottom in the corner, these are the doses that people receive, assuming that there's no early on-site intrusion by members of the public. But if on-site intrusion does occur, then the actual doses to the public will increase by this much, all the way here to the top left-hand corner. That's a difference of 10,000 times in the radiation exposure to members of the public, completely dependent on whether or not on-site intrusion to this facility is prevented. So we have some recommendations. Considering that we found 3 modes of failure, there are 3 recommendations, one to address each of these possible ways that the project fails. Obviously, public radiation exposure allowances must be prorated, meaning we have to include all the different sources of radiation and make sure no one is receiving more than the maximum allowable amount of radiation the law allows. Now, this isn't saying that the maximum permissible amount is safe, but anything above that is not legal. Anything below that is legal. If it exceeds that number, the project cannot lawfully proceed. Second recommendation is to prohibit uncharacterized waste streams from being disposed of in the IDF. And the last is the proposed project fails if public access to the IDF is not prevented for closure plus 100 years or more. And we have to have a way in advance of making sure that that doesn't happen before the project is approved. There's a little more detail on that first recommendation where we go through some of the different limits that apply. But essentially, again, there are multiple projects and they all need to be accounted for before we proceed with this one. The second recommendation involves prohibiting waste streams because we can't lawfully say that we're going to meet these standards if we don't even know what is going to be in the waste that's going to be disposed of. And finally, and most importantly, this project can't succeed without doing additional work to prevent intrusion on the site. Depending on political means, what they call institutional controls is not sufficient. The IDF needs to actually be engineered. It needs to be constructed in a way that early on-site intrusion no longer causes failure, as opposed to depending on guards, fences, and regulations to keep people out. So there are other sites where we have worked where the Department of Energy did not rely on institutional controls to prevent on-site intrusion. They actually changed the physical nature and construction of the repositories that they built so that it is impervious to early on-site intrusion. And one of the examples that I chose for today was the Weldon Springs site, which is in St. Louis, Missouri, and is designed to allow members of the public to intrude on the site without endangering the safeguards for the waste that's buried below. This is a picture of this example. Those two people that are there are on-site intruders. This is a literal mountain built out of an armoring of stone and other materials that covers the landfill into which the state of Missouri and the Department of Energy have put radioactive wastes left over from the Manhattan Project, mostly uranium and radium. These are still radioactive and dangerous. And in fact, they actually encourage on-site intrusion. The site is open to the public. It has a museum and a gift shop and an interpretive nature trail. It's not like anything else you've seen. And these on-site intruders that you can see in the photographs are actually elementary school kids from the surrounding towns who make field trips out to this nuclear waste disposal facility and get to walk on top of it, take pictures, look around, do selfies. But essentially what we've done is we've created an environment that is engineered to make on-site intrusion irrelevant, as opposed to depending on politics to prevent on-site intruders that would ultimately cause the waste site to fail. And that's essentially it for us. These are the issues that we see that are going to be needed to be fixed in order to prevent the on-site intrusion. And a summary of our recommendations. Liz, that's it for me. I'd be happy to answer questions. I imagine there might be a couple.
Yeah, I think I'll go over just what our comment guide for people so you know where you can find it, and then we'll open it up to questions. Thanks, Marco, that was great. For people who have been here before, you're probably familiar with our Say What guides, and we've just done a little redesign on our website. So if you go to hanfordchallenge.org /VLAW, vitrified low activity waste, that fun new acronym you learned today, you will get to all the materials that we talked about, including presentations that you saw today. So our Say What guide is here. And the gist of what hasn't really come up yet is that Hanford Challenge, Columbia Riverkeeper, and the Natural Resources Defense Council have worked together to write joint comments on this topic. This is the second time the WEIR process has been used at Hanford, and the first one, they haven't come out with a final determination yet on some waste, the waste that they are planning to leave in the sea farm tanks. So we are opposing the use of WEIR, and basically a judge has said that it's illegal to use the WEIR process, and we're agreeing with that. So that's the only thing that you might see differently in here than you've heard today so far. So this just kind of goes over what you heard today, goes through some of our concerns related to the proposal that Marco covered, some of the context that Todd talked about. It has some graphics that you can zoom in on to really see how they're planning to move this waste around to get it to this lined landfill. And the cells of the integrated disposal facility, the IDF, that they want to bury, where they want to bury this waste. Our comments that we're suggesting are, and we have a separate link if you want to copy and paste them, if that's helpful for anyone, is to use an NRC determination, not a WEIR determination. And that the NRC determination is a little bit amorphous, but it would be putting the NRC in charge of determining whether or not this waste can be buried at this landfill. Using engineered controls, not institutional controls. So another way to say that is keep the waste isolated from the humans instead of using guards and fences to keep the humans away from the waste. And then a new point that I'll bring up, and we also have someone on the call today from Oregon Department of Energy who might be able to help put some context around this point about the process they're using for this vitrified low activity waste. Some removes iodine and technetium-99, which are key radionuclides that are risk drivers. The DOE is currently trying to force those back into the glass. So basically iodine-129 and technetium-99 don't want to stay in the glass, but they want to force it in. And we're saying, and others are saying, including the NRC, why don't you just keep that steam that's removed these radionuclides and put that in the high-level waste stream that would have to go to that national repository that Todd was talking about. Another catch-all, that's a really nice one. The NRC have a review of the WEIR. They kind of have a somewhat of a relationship with the WEIR, but they don't get to say yes or no, but they do have a process to review and provide comments and ask questions. And we really like the questions they're asking. So we're recommending people kind of give a nod to that and say, resolve all of the staff's concerns and comments to their satisfaction. And then the cumulative impacts point here about look at all of the risks around for any waste site that may leave waste on the Hanford site forever that could be a risk to future people. And just a bigger picture point is just thinking about who might use the site. So we talked about that a little bit. Every decision about what waste will be left on site is imagining a future of how that site will be used. So will tribes be able to use that land? Will it be industrial use? Will it be farmers? Will it be tourists? Who is going to be using this land? And so as you're thinking through how you want to comment, thinking about how you imagine that can be a helpful exercise. How would those people be protected in different ways they'd be using the land? And then to submit the comments, this is the email you use, and they just are due by this Friday, November 27th, the day after Thanksgiving, and we will send out a reminder. And then there's a bunch of reference links at the bottom to the NRC for people who want to dig into the weeds, the NRC's request for additional information, documents here and some presentations, all of the Department of Energy presentations, Our joint comments, which go into more detail about all those points, are also linked, Marco's presentation, and then some sample comments. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can get to those links too. So now we're going to open up to questions. So feel free to unmute and ask a question, or put your question in the chat. Let's see if we have any. And Nicholas did also say we are going to share this, the recording of this. So we're going to trim it to the presentations and share that by email and on our website too. Any questions or comments? We've got, what is the likelihood of Hanford ever becoming like Weldon Springs? Does anyone have a thought on that?
I do, actually. The cost of the engineered controls for the IDF landfill is actually very small compared to the overall cost of the project. So I would think that because the lack of engineering controls stand between this being a lawful project and an unlawful one, I think the odds of that are actually fairly good.
And I saw Julie weighing in. Julie, do you want to say more about thinking that it's unlikely that will happen? You're on mute. Can you unmute?
Thanks to all the presenters. I appreciate your time and work. I said none because when I have I'm aware of that that barrier in that project and think it's got great features on it for Hanford. But as far as the ultimate goal, because of Hanford's setting of IDF, so we've got an integrated disposal facility landfill that they were required to build, and it's you know, it's like almost 20 years old. So it's in the 200 area that's next to 41 miles of buried waste trenches that have not been characterized or remediated. It's not far from Erdif, which is the other landfill across the road that's got a very questionable performance assessment. It's been commented on a lot over the last 25 years by a lot of people who are on this call. So just that my point is, IDF is one little envelope of managed waste they're proposing in the middle of a lot of uncharacterized unknowns, including a contaminated vadose zone, because it's so near all the production facilities. So it doesn't mean the engineered features on that project wouldn't be good things to consider on IDF. But whenever a WEIR is proposed that I've commented on in the past, I think it's important to just all of us do a 360 and think about what else is really around this WEIR that is not taken into account, because NRC only looks at what they're asked to look at, and they don't look out here. And that's not a criticism, it's just that's how they comment. And you can't really look at Hanford cumulative risk that way, as you've really brought out. And the performance assessment is meant to assess if all this waste was released over time because everything leaks and fails, what would happen. And they don't know what else they're going to put in the landfill, which you brought out, all of you. And so at best, it seems like they should make this a boutique landfill that is only for this specific waste stream that they fully understand. And that these canisters could, of course, be retrievable if for some reason there was a future technology that could do better. I don't like to let them through a loophole of retrievable storage, because that means disposal at Hanford. But those are my comments. I think that barrier design has a lot of good features on it. I have been responsible for IDF in a past job and inspecting it. And everybody keep in mind all the pumps and pipelines and valves and everything that was put into IDF per regulators is now really old and hasn't really been used yet. So I think it may need a pretty good upgrade to meet the technology of today, just to be the best it could be. That's it.
I certainly can agree with that. I know that I have very few things in my house that are complicated, mechanical, and 100 years old and still working. So we're talking 152 years old at the end of the design life for some of these items.
Mhm.
I could certainly appreciate that. Robert Masterson asks, what is known about underground water movement under the proposed storage sites at Hanford? Well, that's a mixed bag. The water movement itself under present conditions is fairly well understood. Of course, the problem comes from potential climate change that would increase the amount of aquifer recharge. Even a small amount of rainfall would increase the very few millimeters of recharge that this area gets every year. And the other is the chemistry of what happens to the leaking waste, and it will leak. It's designed to leak. The chemistry of that waste in the Beto zone is not really understood. So it's not clear how well the leaking waste will move with groundwater. Will it solidify and stay there and not move with passing groundwater? Or will it become soluble and move almost as fast as the groundwater itself? This is an unknown. And I saw from the chats during the presentations, someone asked about wildfire and climate change. Wildfire can affect recharge rates because if wildfire removes the plant material from the surface, that will potentially change how much of the existing rainfall recharges that aquifer and speeds up the movement of groundwater through the site.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. And another piece that I don't think we really pulled out was the leachate. So this landfill has a leachate collection system to collect some of, as things leak, remove and treat the leachate. However, this is, another part, and Marco, you can talk to this too, about how long that would have to function. I don't know if you want to say.
It's an interesting point of view. This happens at many landfills where rainfall and snowmelt creates leachate, which leaves the landfill. And people can either treat that leachate somewhere, or they can just recycle it by dumping it back to the top of the landfill. There is a sump system to collect that leachate. It's assumed that that sump system will fail at closure plus 100 years. But the risks that we see in their numbers for this project do assume that those sumps will continue to operate for the next 132 years. And as it was pointed out, some of those materials are already 20 years old.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute and just jump in.
So my thought on 100-year-old technology was, if we look at 100-year-old phones, there were cherry wood boxes nailed to the wall where you turned a crank and you asked someone to connect you, which is a little different from the pocket phones everyone uses now.
Just a little different. Jeff, I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about the iodine and technetium issue and just help explain that a little bit better than I did.
Sure. Hi there, I'm Jeff Burright with the Oregon Department of Energy. Most of what I work on relates to the Hanford tanks and the waste treatment plant. Before I talk about the tech and the iodine, the first thing I want to respond to is this idea that we're going to have 100-year-old pumps failing. My understanding of how this landfill is actually going to operate and be maintained for that 100-year period that they give themselves credit for is that if something fails, they'll replace it. If something breaks, they'll fix it. So I don't know that I would agree with this idea that in the next 100 years, you're going to have failed pumps affecting the risk to the public. Beyond that 100-year period, it's assumed that people are not there to be the Maytag man, if you will, and to fix things as they break. So just one perspective I'd like to offer there. Regarding the technetium and the iodine, these two nuclides, from my perspective, are among your worst actors long-term. It was true also in the Yucca Mountain high-level waste repository, the performance assessment they did there. And the reason is that they last a very long time and they're very mobile in the environment. They move at about the same speed as water through the environment. And so if they become released from the waste form that's been buried in the landfill, whether that be glass or grout, which the waste treatment plant that's producing this waste is producing glass, but it's also producing a grouted secondary waste form. Now, what is secondary waste? That is what happens when, as you dump the radionuclides and the glass formers into a hot crucible and you're creating this glass, it's at, I think, 1100 degrees centigrade, you are producing off gases. You're producing steam, for lack of a better term. And technetium and iodine, not only are they long-lived and very mobile in the environment, they volatilize at a lower temperature than the temperature at which glass is formed, meaning they burn off. So now they escape into the off gas at a fairly high rate. And those off gases are then caught in submerged bed scrubbers, carbon, like a Brita filter, HEPA filters, or they are then recycled and sent back into the glass stream. And that's what Liz was talking about before. And on one of the technical calls between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the DOE, the NRC made kind of an interesting point that, you know, the first criterion for a WEIR is that you are removing key radionuclides to the maximum extent practical. And the tech and the iodine are, I would consider, key radionuclides from a risk perspective. And if you have a process where you're making glass and you're essentially burning off the tech and the iodine, that's actually a pretty effective removal technology for these key radionuclides. So the next question is, well, what do you do with them? If they are truly key radionuclides that would make the difference between conceiving of something as a high-level waste that needs long-term protection, deep underground storage, versus not high-level waste, which can be disposed of in a shallow environment. If these are the ones that tend to make the difference, maybe we ought to be a little bit more precautionary and send those into the high-level waste stream instead. So that's my thought.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, Jeff was key at explaining this point to me, so that was helpful. And obviously there's, you know, I think what a big piece of all these decisions is there's a lot we don't know, and things that are still being figured out